PM Weekly starting right now, bringing emergency managers from around the world together to learn, share and collaborate.
Hey, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are coming to us from. I am Daniel Scott. I am filling in just temporarily for a short-term basis for Todd, our host today, Todd DeVoe. Today we are going to talk about we're going to kind of do a recap of IAM, which we were at last week. If you didn't get to go, please try and join us next year, which will be in November, and it'll be in Savannah, Georgia. But today we are going to talk about the systemic cyber risk reduction venture, and we are going to. I'm so sorry. Can we bring in our guest today? Hey, Bob, I'm sorry. I don't want to mess up your last name. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Bob Kolaski. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and I run the National Risk Management Center. Great to be with you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning and talk to us about your new venture, and maybe to give us a quick introduction on the venture and what it is that it is actually encompassing.
Sure. One of the things, as I said, I run an organization called the National Risk Management Center, which is a planning and analysis collaboration center where industry and government work together to reduce risk to the nation's critical infrastructure. And of course, as part of the Cybersecurity Agency, we focus a lot on cybersecurity risk. And in doing so, and I think it's great to be here with the emergency management community, it's time to start to think about cybersecurity risk from the perspective of real-world impacts on functions of things that are really important to us. And we've seen a crossover in certainly throughout this year of adversaries going after systems in a way that have real-world impacts, most prominently the Colonial Pipeline incident, which I'm sure we can talk about a little bit as we go forward. And the Colonial Pipeline incident ends with people waiting in line in the Northeast for gas, right? And gas hoarding, things that, emergency management communities used to dealing with. And so with that just sort of simple mental model in mind and experience we all went through, the venture that we launched, the Systemic Cyber Risk Reduction Venture, is really to better have the ability to understand the impact of cyber incidents in terms of potential functional impacts, and to build out the analysis to do that, and then to talk about priorities using risk language and risk metrics, and then to make progress in terms of mitigating cyber risk based on that analysis, based on our priorities using metrics, so that we have some sort of systemic solution so that the country is at less risk from cyber attacks. And that's really what we're trying to do. And we call it a venture because we want it to be a team effort. We want to take advantage of the whole community. We want all the smart people out there to help us better understand risk and mitigate cyber risk.
Well, you said you made mention of a few words that are in a few concepts that are, for me, are huge. These are things that I basically preach. I get up on a soapbox and I preach mitigation and being able to reduce risk, and how we can even prevent certain aspects of what we are attacked with every day, whether that be nature or that be someone who's trying out there to actually do intentional harm. But I want to touch on one thing real quick before we move on, is that you made a very good point about bringing the cybersecurity aspect into emergency management and engaging the emergency management profession. How do you see emergency management? Because this is something that keeps coming up. Do emergency management play a role in cybersecurity, and should they play a role in cybersecurity? So from your point of view, how do you see emergency management playing a role in this?
Yeah, sure. We're here talking about cyber, but just a little bit of my background. The National Risk Management Center is an all hazards risk management center. We are concerned about anything that can bring down impacts to critical infrastructure. And, I've got a lot of experience working with the emergency management community on impacts to critical infrastructure, particularly around hurricanes and flooding and wind disasters and wildfires and the kinds of things that emergency managers around the country are dealing with. And so, those concepts are I think resonate a lot with me. And I think applying some of those concepts to cyber is useful, and it will help bring together the community, because using the language, using the emergency management and overall risk management language similarly across potential hazards is a useful exercise, and emergency managers do very much have a role to play in cyber, and particularly the role is being prepared to mitigate the impacts of something happening in an information technology system or an operational technology system, particularly operational technology, that then causes the thing that the digitalization empowers to not be working, and then plays out through the cascading impacts of that happening. And so, cybersecurity, and one of the things we're trying to do at the agency is think about resilience as much as security, right? And think about holistic risk management. And if you can't do that much damage through cyberspace, through attacking our digitalization on the actual real world impacts, then we've done a good job of managing risk. And of course, the emergency management community is where we look to for some of the key aspects of building resilience into systems, planning for resilience, preparedness, and all those good concepts. Let's do it around cyber incidents so that we have the preparedness and resilience again, so the adversary can't cause the level of harm that becomes a national security issue.
This was announced back in January, correct?
Yes.
And so how does this play a role in training those who would be taking part in this initiative?
Sure. So a lot of what we've been doing right now in the first part of it is better mapping out what we call national critical functions. And example of a national critical function is the idea of conducting elections, right? So conducting elections is critical. So is generating electricity. So is the provision of medical care, the availability of core communications networks. And so what we've done with those critical functions, which are available on our website, we published in 2019, and we've been really spending the last period mapping out our understanding of how those functions work so we can better identify sources of risk within those functions. And that then plays out in the real world around things like conduct elections, where I've got a pretty good understanding at this point how, you and I as voters, as citizens, register, our vote gets counted, our vote gets certified, and ultimately the culmination of a voting process ends up with a democratic decision. We've mapped that system, and then we've looked for areas where there's cyber risk in that election system. And we partnered with, so how does the community get involved? We partnered with the state election directors, secretaries of state, local election officials, and others who manage aspects of the risk there to find real areas to mitigate cyber risk, and then cyber risk ultimately to the conduct of our elections. And that's the kind of thing that we can do with the spirit of collaboration in the venture. Understand the risk, partner to identify the real sources of risk, and then use a whole community perspective to go after it.
So how many a community, or how might a community actually partner with you in doing this?
Sure. We rely at CISA very much on structured partnership with industry through something called the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council. And we have somewhere in the order of representatives of thousands of businesses that manage critical infrastructure, who we work with through the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council. Private sector's also established a bunch of things, a bunch of organizations, information sharing organizations called Information Sharing Analysis Centers, ISACs, that are open for people to join to get more information sharing. And then we work with state, local, tribal, territorial governments through a coordinating council of state, local, tribal, territorial governments. We work closely with the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, the Homeland Security Advisors, you mentioned IAEM, some of the emergency managers. And so those are ways to get involved in our work. We certainly are frequently talking to the associations, to membership. And then at a local level, we have security advisors around the country, protective security advisors, cybersecurity advisors that are partners at local levels in working to mitigate critical infrastructure risk at that level. And so, there are a lot of different ways to get involved.
Very cool. I want to go back to the mitigation question in just a minute. I have, but I want to ask a question that Todd has. So where is DHS in terms of understanding what is a very long list of national critical function and analyzing risk to those functions?
So Todd's right. There are 55 critical functions. And if you think about the critical functions, those are the things, and we use the mental model that if they're not working, that's a bad day from a national security, from a community well-being perspective. And while it is a long list, unfortunately, those are things that we have to address risk. Where we are within that, we've mapped out a lot of how those functions work. We've had a heavy focus on the lifeline functions, particularly around the energy functions in transportation, communications, and water. We've done a lot of work around election security, and we've mapped out, and we're starting to adjust how we think about what priority critical infrastructure is, priority assets and systems, and the things that are most important in the functions. And again, I really like to talk about it in terms of real world. Our understanding of the pipeline infrastructure, and how oil flew through the Colonial Pipeline helped us understanding the potential impact of a Colonial Pipeline shutdown, so that we can manage risk further downstream of where there were key elements that were relying on the product that was flowing through the pipeline. And that kind of work has happened because we put the effort in to map the infrastructure.
Well, how does data science play a role in its development?
Sure. So data science in this area, right? The science of modeling how information flows in terms of how functions work, right? That's a little bit of a modeling thing. And then data science comes in, that we've got to take data sources from multiple places and put that data together such that we can, and this is where we're still somewhat immature, we can talk about the aggregate of the data in terms of risk, risk metrics and qualifying risk. And so I'm getting data from threat feeds. We're getting data from, people who understand how supply chains work and how things flow, operational data. We're getting data from vulnerability assessments. We're getting data from, weather effects and consequences of things not working. And we've got to figure out a way to merge that data into our models. And that's, we've got some data scientists that work for us, and that's really what we're trying to do.
This is a side note for what I just heard, but is it, do you guys get to read that information and get information in real time?
Most of the time for risk data, there are places, of course, that we want to have real-time information. But, a lot of what I'm trying to do is paint an aggregate risk picture, and real-time data shouldn't change our risk too much, but it will adjust. And then in the moments of crisis, the easiest thing for our emergency management community, in the moments pre-hurricane, we're looking at real time what we think the infrastructure impacts are. And as we see the infrastructure impacts, we're putting it into our model to understand it. We're trying to build the same thing in cyber, where we see that there are incidents happening. And again, we can sort of assess the impacts of those incidents at scale, and whether they're going to have real-time impact on functions, so that we can decide if something's a big enough emergency in the real world, in addition to addressing the digital issues.
So, to bring it back to mitigation, other than getting involved, how does this information allow us to mitigate the potential threats or risks that are present out there? What is it that we can do as a mitigative individual, myself? What is it that we can do other than just getting involved to use this information to prevent something larger happening?
So, mitigation and preparedness sit next to each other. So starting with preparedness and doing the planning and exercising and stress testing of your systems, how a cyber incident, how a ransomware incident could impact your operations, and designing in a backup plan to operate if you can't do certain things because your system is locked because somebody's popped it with ransomware. That's one aspect of mitigation, bringing in additional preparedness to stress test the system. There are other areas of mitigation that I think are important. Knowing your suppliers, knowing where you get the things you are dependent on. Again, everyone's dependent on energy and communications. Everyone's depending on transportation. Having plans to have backup operations if some of those dependencies aren't working. Again, knowing your suppliers, having alternative sources of supply. If you lose access to one supplier, that's another important element of mitigation. Certainly, cyber risk mitigation means following cyber best practices, adopting the frameworks that are appropriate that are out there to make sure you have good cyber in place. So there are lots of different areas that you can mitigate. Think it from a risk perspective: protect the system, plan to operate if the system fails, have alternative access to things if you can't operate if the system fails, so that you can continue operation. You can shift how you do operations.
Very cool. Thank you. I actually have another question I'd like to touch on. What's kind of a comment mixed in with a question from Todd. It says, cyber risk quantification is an important part of this entire effort. But as you well know, many companies, including critical infrastructure companies, do not currently have an ability to do this correctly in a way that identifies and prioritizes threats, vulnerabilities that are most important to their businesses and IT environment. Mm-hmm. This is both an operational risk and financial risk. And here comes the question. What will your approach to cyber risk quantification look like? And will there be a role for security providers that do this work to help inform the effort?
So definitely, and Todd, first of all, I appreciate Todd's question, but Todd's statement is great. Amen to Todd's statement. The question, we hosted in April a workshop, a dialogue workshop with, companies that are really in the cyber risk metric business. I think you've seen an advancement at the corporate level, and this, unfortunately applies more to big corporations than small corporations, that there has been some investment to understand cyber risk as part of an overall enterprise risk process and quantify where there is risk to business operations by understanding high value assets, high value operations, and putting some dollar value on the impact of loss of operations and evaluating threats and doing that. So you've seen that work at the corporate level. That they're often, and we're trying to learn from that. There are different ways of thinking about metrics. We're trying to encourage a more harmonized approach. But then on top of that, this community, we're more interested in resilience and national security than we perhaps are the impact to the corporate bottom line. So how do you translate some of those concepts that this is the potential impact to my bottom line to this is the impact to the greater good? And that's the nut I'd like to crack a little bit. Another source of good information is the cyber insurance market and the insurance market where they priced in cyber risk to write insurance policies. But again, they're pricing in cyber risk from what they're insuring against, not necessarily the whole aspect of cyber resilience that a community would rely on or cybersecurity. And so how to start with the information and data that's in those more mature places where risk metrics exist and build that into a framework so that we can talk about it from the ultimate outcome of security and resilience.
As far as, and this may be outside the realm of what we're talking about, but as far as infrastructure goes, and dealing with because all of our infrastructure is cyber almost. We're completely reliant on technology these days. As far as like redundancy, if someone were to come in and we have a hazard and they attack that vulnerability, how quickly can we get up and running again, or take steps to at least alleviate some of the damage that's going to be taken from the technology going down?
That's a good question that should be considered from a lot of different aspects. And in some ways, that's why Tom mentioned the lots of critical functions. There are lots of ways to answer that question. There are lots of things that could go down that have different impact from operations. Let me give you an example of where I think we made some real progress, and that's on the function of position, navigation, and timing, GPS. And we've worked hard with different critical infrastructure aspects, critical infrastructure industries to understand, to your precise question, if you lose precision timing, which banks and transportation networks rely on, if you lose precision navigation, which all transportation networks rely on, but so do farms and those sorts of things. Can you operate in a degraded state where you're manually, using old time, not digital, you're using old time analog capability, and give us the answer of whether you can do that, and think about ways to buy backup so that you can get something stood up. And so we've worked a lot. GPS comes from satellites, but we've worked a lot on terrestrial backups, localized backups for that, so that you don't have to operate in that long of a degraded time. And it helps you understand, by doing this sort of thinking, it helps you understand kind of how important it is to invest in analog backup capability. And, the cool thing is we've seen through this kind of risk work that we sent a signal to the market that there's an interest in analog backup to GPS. And we've seen a lot of innovation, terrestrial and then other ways to use near-Earth satellites, so that there are alternative sources. So now you can buy it in a lot of cases. And when we were having this conversation 7 years ago, there wasn't the ability to buy it nearly as much. The banks have figured it out because it's so key to, nanoseconds are so key to their business, but a lot of others hadn't. And I think you've seen a marketplace stand up, and that's important in emergency management. I talk all about this without talking about next gen 911, without talking about having 911 available in closed-in space, and all that again, relies on precision communications capability and having backups.
Well, this may be going down a little bit of a rabbit hole with where my mind is right now. But you mentioned going back to the way, doing things the way we used to, and one of the things that I've noticed with our reliance on technology and cyber and whatever else we're relying on now that's not directly in front of us, right? It's all in the cloud, and we lose that. I mean, there are. I mean, it's hard. You're hard pressed to find a hard copy map. You're hard pressed to find a phone book. You're hard. These are things that they don't really do anymore. How is that going to hinder us if we are no longer able to access that information?
Yeah, it's. So it's not going backwards, right? But it is building in redundancy and robustness as we go forward. Let's talk about voting again. And we had a real movement in this country post 2000 to, less reliance on paper ballots. And we all remember the butterfly ballots and the hanging chads and all that. Now let's do it by computer. Then there's less ambiguity in who people voted for. And you saw, for the purpose of that, for good purposes, a real push to digitalization. Then the Russians decided to screw a little bit with our election system. Other adversaries started to think about it, said, you know what, let's make sure they can't. Let's have paper backups. Let's have risk limiting audits. Let's have some techniques that, we're still going to take advantage of digitalization and managing identities that way for the voter to make it efficient for folks to vote, particularly folks voting overseas and people who have trouble getting to the polling places. But we're going to have redundancy and backups using, more analog solutions. And, you've seen it play out with audits around the country where you may have questions at the underlying technology, but the fact of the matter is we've got paper audits, we've got a paper trail, and there is no evidence of that paper trail that the technology didn't report accurately on the results of the voting. And that's been tested, around the countries in multiple state audits.
You may have already been asked this next question previously, and this could be more opinion based than informational, but we have in emergency management, and I'm sure it's like that in other industries as well, but in emergency management, you have those that are like old school, right? They're 25 years into the job. They're like, I'm never going to learn technology. Before I learn it, I'm going to leave. And then you have the new generation coming in, and they're all about technology. They have no basically historic reference to the old way of doing things, paper, right? Yeah. And doing it. How do we blend that in a way? And this could be more of opinion based versus if you have a strategy behind it. How do we blend it and make it where that the older generation wants to incorporate technology, and the newer generation comes in and is learning about older technology? Yeah.
How do you pass wisdom from generation to generation? If only we could have figured that one out, and we wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past, right? I think that's a good question. Some of it is, right, obviously some is in curriculum design, of certificates, of other ways that you train folks, and having a certainly on the junior side, as people get trained up, thinking about it from a resilience and risk mitigation perspective, and not just a pure efficiency, and take advantage of all of that. And we've seen progress in this area, and we're working to put more money into things like industrial control systems engineering, which blends historical practices and new technologies, but you need that sort of blend in terms of going the other way from the older generation toward digitalization, I found, and I try to do that we talk about cybersecurity and digitalization I keep saying the word in real world concepts, but in things that we know how to talk about. So if you're an engineer that's working somewhere, if you're an emergency manager, this technology is to enable something that you've always been doing and teaching you how to use the technology in the context of what you've already been doing, rather than the technology it's enabler, right? And so, continue to play with those concepts as you work through curriculum design, as you design, interactions, and this is great about the emergency management community, and I would say others, right? It is things are passed on sort of generation to generation. That's the expectation that you will do that. And, there is a respect for the legacy. And I think there needs to be that in different places.
Yeah, with myself, one of the things that I try and teach and promote is the evolution is great. We want to evolve as the professional. We want to evolve as a profession. We also, there's things that we cannot lose that's related to our history and how we've done things, and how those things could either influence how we do things in the future or don't do things in the future based on things that have happened. But the use of technology itself, this is technology. But how you use it is, a lot of people don't use pencil and pads anymore. It's all on their phones, or they're dictating onto their, writing it. Either they're typing it out, they're dictating it to a voice audio, or they're writing it in emails. But if we lose that, are you able to? Just to give you a quick example of mine before I let you go. Just recently in my organization, we lost our network, and when we lost our network, we lost everything. We lost our internet, we lost our phones, we lost our email, we lost all these things, and people didn't know what to do. They're like, well, how do I do my job? Do I go home? It's like, no, you don't go home. We got a job to do here. So these are things that we have to overcome with the newer generation, because our reliance on technology. But technology, it's great until it doesn't work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's backup, right? That's backup. That's testing that stuff and exercise and having plans in place, right? The Colonial Pipeline incident was the computers didn't work and they shut down the pipeline. There was nothing that fundamentally happened to the pipeline other than your business was run on the computers, and you didn't have confidence that you could run the pipelines without the computer system working. And massively simplified that, but it's like, no, there should be an ability to continue to flow your core business even without over some period of time. We've seen this play out in healthcare ransomware attacks as well. It's like, do we have enough information that we can deliver essential healthcare at a hospital if the computers are down and you can't get access to digitalized medical records? And at this point, particularly for critical care, please design in that there's enough information that you can still provide critical care for people who are sort of a life-threatening situation, and that's hard. It takes investment. Yeah, it takes training.
Well, Bob, I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and explain this to us and kind of give us a lesson on it. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you or learn more about what it is that you're offering?
Yeah, we've done hopefully a pretty good job. We're catching up with our website, so CISA.gov, and there's a lot of different aspects of what I've talked about that you can see. I work in election security, I work on cyber risk metrics, things that we've done in supply chain, critical infrastructure identification, all that. So please start there. Around the country, again, it's our security advisors that are in every state and in most major cities around the country, probably every major city at this point around the country there, and are an asset to work with CISA. So, I would encourage particularly emergency managers around the country to make sure they have a relationship with security advisors, because they can help sort of understand critical infrastructure impacts, because, a lot of times the bad day gets made worse if critical infrastructure is not working.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you for joining us, and I'll catch you offline in just a minute. Thanks for joining EM Weekly this week. I want to thank, I don't want to forget to thank our sponsor, Disaster Tech. Without them, we couldn't bring you the program we're bringing you. Just thank you for joining us this morning. If you do reach out to Disaster Tech, let them know you came across them here at EM Weekly, and we will see you next week. And if, as Todd says, stay hydrated.